Today is January 20th, and according to the Roman calendar, the feast day of St. Sebastian. St. Sebastian is a fascinating phenomenon. I say phenomenon rather than individual because the historical person of the saint, thickly veiled behind a fog of religious reinterpretation and mythologizing, is actually pretty hard to get to. This process of mythologizing began in at least the 5th century. It absolutely took off during the Renaissance, and it has reached its apex today, for St. Sebastian has become the unofficial patron saint of homosexuality, showing up in the gay art and culture constantly throughout the centuries, and particularly the previous one. This is really fascinating to me on a couple of levels. First of all, any saint that's embraced by the modern world already has my attention. The Catholic worldview is so antithetical to the modern secular one that the latter can barely comprehend the former, which leads to a lot of misunderstanding and misrepresentation of its theology whenever the media tries to present it. Naturally, Thomas Aquinas, Catherine of Siena, and Boniface aren't exactly going to be household names in this environment. Yet there are a few figures from the Catholic roster that the modern world continues to really exalt and continue to be fascinated by. Figures like Joan of Arc, Francis of Assisi, and of course our Sebastian. And that's the other thing that interests me. Why Sebastian? Why did they pick him to be the icon of gayness? Why not one of the female saints who dressed like a man, like a Theodora or the aforementioned Joan of Arc? For that matter, why not the controversial couple Sergius and Bacchus, who were such close companions that some historians have even gone so far as to claim that they were united to each other in a gay marriage? Sebastian, in contrast, has nothing in his story that seems particularly gay, so how did he land this peculiar status? Well, the answer has to do not so much with the historical Sebastian as with his later representation by iconographers and artists. In this video, I want to give a cursory but hopefully thoughtful examination to how he came to this cultural position, and also make some suggestions as to how the Church should respond to this modern appropriation of the saint. But first, let's look at the historical Sebastian himself, albeit through a glass darkly. This is taken from the Lives of the Saints. St. Sebastian the Martyr, patron of athletes. St. Sebastian was born at Narbonne in Gaul, educated at Milan, and martyred at Rome about the year 284. According to an account of the 5th century now considered unhistorical... Okay, stop right there. Let's turn to this book. Today we celebrate some priest writing about the history of saints. There are 3 4th century accounts of the martyrdom of Sebastian, and they illustrate very clearly for us how inaccurate oral tradition can be, for all 3 accounts differ on how the martyr died, though all agree on his name and the place of his death, Rome. Already we can see the lens of interpretation and reappropriation kind of rising up to cover Sebastian. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting we can't know anything at all about the guy. In fact, I'm more optimistic than most people about the veracity of the various legends of the saints, but I am saying that whenever we try to think about Sebastian, we have to realize that whoever we're thinking about, whatever concept of Sebastian we're referring to, that's inseparable from a community that was claiming him. Now, back to the lives. He entered the army at Rome under the Emperor Carinus, about the year 283, in order to render assistance to the martyrs. St. Sebastian had prudently concealed his religion, but he was at last detected and accused before Diocletian, who condemned him to be shot to death with an arrow. The sentence was executed to the extent that he was left for dead. Restored to health by the care of a pious widow, that's St. Irene of Rome, by the way, whose feast day is 2 days after Sebastian's, he boldly appeared before the emperor and reproached him for his injustice against the Christians. The emperor, recovering from his surprise at beholding St. Sebastian alive, commanded that he be beaten to death with clubs. His body was thrown into a sewer, but a pious lady had it privately removed and buried it in the catacombs. Now, there are a couple of miracles that happened after Sebastian's death, and of course in Catholicism 2 miracles are required in order for a saint to be canonized, that are really interesting in the light of the later developments that had to do with Sebastian's ecclesial and cultural legacy. The first of those had to do with a woman that was intending to attend the dedication of a chapel to St. Sebastian, but having recently been married, she succumbed to her passions, and the night before she was going to attend this, she made love to her husband. The next morning, when she entered the chapel that was at the time housing Sebastian's relics, she was promptly attacked by demons. The account tells us there were 6,666 of these demons, until a holy man, I believe named Fortunus, was able to exorcise her. Now, by the way, this story does show, it illustrates what I'm talking about how Catholicism is so bizarre and unfathomable to the modern world, how different its conceptions both of sex and of spirituality are. And that's just it. It's interesting that even here, Sebastian is already linked in some way to this strange connection between sexual intercourse and religious devotion. Now, the other story had to do with, the other miracle I ought to say, had to do with the plague. It was when the Black Death was ravaging Italy, and God apparently appeared to a holy man and told him that the plague would be lifted as soon as an altar was erected to St. Sebastian in the Church of St. Peter in Chains, which of course is in Rome. This was done, and sure enough, as promised, the disease was promptly lifted. This had an interesting result, which is discussed in the Oxford Dictionary of Saints. He also had a widespread patronage against the plague, due either to his invocation in a particular case of cessation of plague, or to his courage in facing arrows which enabled him to immunize his devotees against it. This is no doubt the reason why St. Sebastian was so frequently depicted during the Renaissance, or at least the pretext for it. The plague was still freaking people out, and he was the go-to guy for that. But this is where it gets interesting. This is where the shift starts to occur. Let me go back to the dictionary for this one. The earliest representations of Sebastian depict him as an elderly bearded man holding a crown. There are also later examples of this type. But the more familiar one of his being pierced with arrows, notwithstanding the poor quality of the literary source, was extremely popular in the 15th century, supposedly because it gave Renaissance artists opportunities to portray a young and sometimes effeminate male nude in an ecclesiastical context. And here's where the armchair psychologizing centuries after the fact starts. We can infer that the homosexual Renaissance artists were drawn to St. Sebastian because it gave them an opportunity to show a youthful man, and they focused on him being pierced with arrows rather than him being clubbed to death or even being nourished by Irene, so they could depict him in the nude being pierced with arrows. And of course the Freudian symbolism is so obvious, I won't even bother to mention it, except for just there. But I think there might be more intellectual, theological reasons for that. In fact, psychological reasons that are even deeper than the obvious. First of all, let's consider a bit more deeply why the transition from an elderly man to a youthful Adonis was made. We know, of course, that a lot of the glories of pagan Rome were being rediscovered at this point, hence the name the Renaissance. Thus we have the resurgence of art and sculpture that accurately and often sensually portrays the human body. We also have the rediscovery of pagan mythology, and the Renaissance involved a lot of integration of pagan elements into Christian devotion. A practice, of course, with a pretty long history. In fact, it was in full force at the time of St. Sebastian himself. In any event, one of the most striking pagan gods was, of course, Apollo, the beautiful archer god. Although he was known for healing, he could also rain down arrows of plague and disease. In the time of the Black Death, he could be seen as a symbol of the power over life and death. Sebastian, however, who was riddled with arrows, only cured the plague, and as the Oxford Dictionary surmises, his power over the disease came from his suffering. The difference between paganism and Christianity is practically summed up. In paganism, it was excellence that was extolled. It was physical prowess. It was success on the battlefield. It was all these various perfections that gave a god or a human their authority and power. In Christianity, it's the last that shall be first. God doesn't gain our service by lording power over us, but by suffering for us, by identifying with our pain and our disease and our illness. By portraying Sebastian as an Apollo-esque figure who was riddled with bullets instead of firing them, the Renaissance artists subverted the old paganism which was threatening to regain control by putting a victim in the victor's place. On a more pedestrian level, it may also be that they deliberately portrayed Sebastian as physically flawless as possible to give hope and encouragement to those whose bodies were distorted and blemished by the plague. But whatever the theological undergirdings were to this decision, there is no doubting that they created some pretty homoerotic art in the process. Now, did they intend the homoeroticism? Well, I think in a lot of cases it's impossible to say. I mean, we can't really get into their heads for the most part and see what they intended, what was going on in their minds as they painted this stuff. But we can look at those gay artists who responded to it, who mostly did leave a record of what their impressions were, and maybe by analogy we can infer what was going on in the heads of the original creators of this art. The most famous example of these sorts of portrayals of St. Sebastian seems to be that of Guido Rene, which is frequently referenced by the various gay artists who write about this subject. A good example of that is Oscar Wilde. Wilde in 1877 visited the tomb of the poet John Keats, and he subsequently penned these really beautiful and moving words about the event. As I stood before the mean grave of this divine boy, I thought of him as a priest of beauty slain before his time, and the vision of Guido's St Sebastian came before my eyes as I saw him at Genoa, a lovely brown boy with crisp clustering hair and red lips, bound by his evil enemies to a tree, and though pierced by arrows, raising his eyes with divine impassioned gaze towards the eternal beauty of the opening heavens, and my thoughts shaped themselves to rhyme. Rid of the world's injustice and its pain, he rests at last beneath God's veil of blue. Taken from life while life and love were new, the youngest of the martyrs here is lain. Fair as Sebastian and as foully slain, no cypress shades his grave, nor funeral yew, but red-lipped daisies, violet-drenched with dew, and skippy poppies catch the evening rain. Yukio Mishima, like Wilde, is a poet who drew a lot of his vitality from his homosexual experiences. He describes his encounter with the same painting in his semi-autobiographical novel Confessions of a Mask, and it was this encounter which actually prompted his first ejaculation. I began turning a page toward the end of a volume. Suddenly there came into view from one corner of the next page a picture that I had to believe had been lying in wait there for me, for my sake. It was a reproduction of Guido René's St Sebastian, which hangs in the collection of the Palazzo Rosa at Genoa. His face is turned slightly upward, and his eyes are opened wide, gazing with profound tranquility on the glory of heaven. It is not pain that hovers about his strong chest, his tense abdomen, his slightly contorted hips, but some flicker of melancholy pleasure like music. The arrows have eaten into the tense, fragrant, youthful flesh and are about to consume his body from within with flames of supreme agony and ecstasy. But all of these interpretations and observations come later. That day, the instant I looked upon this picture, my entire body trembled with some pagan joy. This is not the only time a poet's sexual discovery has been bound up with his fascination with a Catholic saint, by the way. Leonard Cohen does the same thing in his novel Beautiful Losers with Catherine Tekakwitha. By the way, if the above passage offended you, avoid Cohen's book like the plague. So to speak. I want to emphasize again that the actual story of Sebastian, as much as we know it, doesn't come into play, at least not yet. His status as a sex symbol comes solely from this image, out of context, without any connotations to it. Now, forget for a moment that you know Sebastian is an icon, so to speak, of homosexuality. Forget that. Try to come to this fresh. Why is this particular image so attractive to homosexuals? Is it simply because it depicts a hot guy? Is it because the arrows subconsciously remind them of penetration? Well, okay, pop quiz here. What did Oscar Wilde and Mishima say about that image? What they emphasized was that it was a figure who was going through something painful and yet was being drawn through it by beauty. There was a look of supreme happiness on his face throughout the course of this suffering. That's what really, really grabbed him about it. Now again, there could be a physical suggestion here of an extremely painful act, something that's physically almost harmful, and yet it's mixed with the height of ecstasy. That could all be physical. That's possible, but I think there's something a little bit deeper at play here.